Well, hello there.
In this video, we will be looking at the history of a once proud bus company that was literally hung, drawn and quartered by the National Bus Company. Now that might sound a bit melodramatic, and I'm sure this wasn't the only bus company that was given this treatment, but without a doubt it was one of the first and potentially one of the biggest, and it kind of set a precedent of what the National Bus Company and indeed the PTEs were all about. And this was probably the point where bus companies went from serving the public to money-making machines. Do you think I'm right, or do you think I'm being hypercritical? Please comment down below.
The North Western Road Car Company Limited, to give it its full name, was actually quite a large company. It operated bus services in Cheshire, Derbyshire, Lancashire and Staffordshire and the West Riding of Yorkshire. And if ever there was a company that could officially use the title The Shires, it's this one. North Western was formed in 1923 to take over an operation that had been started by British Automobile Traction at Macclesfield 10 years earlier, in 1913. It was owned jointly by Tilling and British Automobile Traction and became a Tilling British Automobile Traction subsidiary in 1928. And a British Electric Traction subsidiary in 1942.
But we're getting slightly ahead of ourselves here, because in 1929 both the LNER, the London North Eastern Railway, and the LMS, the London Midland and Scottish Railway, bought shares of 50% in the company.
The reason the company got so big was through a series of takeovers, and these included companies such as the Mid Cheshire Bus Company Limited, which included 20 buses, and this was in 1925. Majestic Express Motors Limited in 1933, which it jointly took over with Birmingham Midland Motor Omnibus. The Biddulph and District Motors in 1936, and I do hope I pronounced that correctly, and Altrincham Coachways Limited, as well as Melba Motors Limited, and both of these were taken over in 1958. Both Altrincham Coachways and Melba Motors were operated as subsidiaries until 1967, when the former was sold to Godfrey Abbott Motor Tours Limited. Now, Godfrey Abbott Motor Tours Limited would go on to become part of Greater Manchester Transport. In the early days of the company, the fleet had been based at Macclesfield, but from 1924, the company decided to relocate to a new depot, workshop and offices that had been built in Charles Street in Stockport.
But with all the takeovers of the company and the extra vehicles coming into the fleet, these premises soon proved to be inadequate.
So a new central workshop adjacent to the Charles Street garage was built in 1926, and subsequently all the major engineering works were carried out there. 1927 would see both the local tramway systems in Matlock and Glossop closed down, and North Western would introduce local services in both of these towns to aid the replacement of the trams. By the end of 1927, North Western was operating over 200 buses and had 80 routes. Now, originally North Western had gone for Tilling-Stevens chassis, however, the first Leylands entered the fleet in 1928. During the Second World War, many services of North Western were cut back or abandoned due to the lack of fuel and fuel restrictions. And on top of that, many of the vehicles were requisitioned for war service. However, despite this, during the war, there were more passengers using the company's services than ever before. Now, North Western was primarily a stage carriage operator. That meant they operated buses more than coaches.
But that's not to say they didn't operate express coach services, because they did. They had services that went to far-flung locations such as London, the North Wales coast and Yorkshire.
Indeed, way back in 1929, North Western had become a member of a limited stop pool, which operated a service between Newcastle and Liverpool, and this had been started in 1928 by Northern General. In the post-war period, North Western became a staunch Bristol commercial vehicles customer. However, when the Tilling fleets were nationalised, along with Bristol and Eastern Coachworks, this put Bristol products out of North Western's reach, the last of the Bristols being delivered in 1950. and there was to be an 18-year gap before Bristol vehicles were again available to North Western. But this would mean the company would need to look elsewhere for their supply of new vehicles. Now, a little bit like Ward Brothers with the Ward Dalesman missing the Seddon Pennine, the company were convinced that there was no current vehicle manufacturer that was as good as the Bristol commercial vehicle chassis they had been used to, and this would lead them to design their own chassis. This would eventually emerge as an underfloor engined, rather heavy vehicle, and it would have been built by Atkinson Vehicles of Preston, along with, of course, North Western. The first two of these Atkinson buses entered service in 1951, with 14 more ordered for the following year. Now, the company wanted to order a further 100 of these Atkinson single-deckers, but by this point the company was fully owned by the British Electric Traction Group, as I mentioned earlier, and the BET paymasters said no. And this was in fact due to the fact that the British Electric Traction Group had already committed to orders for the Leyland Royal Tiger, and these would go on to make up the bulk of the delivery for single-deckers for North Western in the next few years. As the company moved into the 1950s, rising car ownership started to hit them in a rather bad way. And this certainly wasn't something, again, that was unique to North Western. This was something that was happening across the UK to many bus and coach operators. Now, a company the size of North Western had a large operating area that would have been in the rural parts of the country, and these rural routes would be financially subsidised by the routes that operated in the more urban and city areas. And despite North Western operating in some relatively urban areas, in 1956 it was stated that over one half of North Western's stage carriage services were operating at a loss. And this is where the spiral of decline starts, not just in North Western but in bus companies in general, because to compensate for the lack of passengers, fares have to rise, which then results in less passengers using the service, which then results in services being cut. A way to help alleviate this would be one-man operation, and this would be introduced in 1958. 1960 would see the arrival of the first of the Dennis Low lines. Now, the Dennis Low line was a licence-produced version of the Bristol Low-Decker, and knowing North Western's love for all things Bristol, it was no surprise that they went for this particular type of chassis. 15 Dennis Low lines turned up in 1960. And they were bodied by East Lancs, and this would be one of the few orders for East Lancs bodywork by a BET company. 35 more Dennis Low lines would arrive with North Western, but these were fitted with a much more curvaceous Alexander bodywork. 1961 would see the company's operating areas split into a northern, central and a southern division, with the ideas of this increasing efficiency and revenue. Later in the 1960s would see new express services to Llandudno, Aberystwyth and Cleethorpes. The 1960s would see the return of Bristol commercial vehicles to the open market. And it's safe to say that North Western was probably at the front of the queue waiting to place orders. And this would eventually result in some rather unique and interesting vehicles in the fleet. Now, I know I say this a lot, but I am actually planning on doing a video on these rather special buses, so I don't want to go into too much detail about them at the moment. But for the sake of completing the North Western story, of course I've got to mention them, haven't I? And what buses am I talking about? Well, let me give you a little bit of background. North Western operated a bus service between Altrincham and Warrington, and this passed beneath a canal bridge at Dunham Massey, which carried the Bridgewater Canal over the road. And this was a very low bridge. The front-engine single-decker buses, which were to a slightly lower build, could just about squeeze underneath the bridge, but the newer underfloor engine buses, which were slightly taller, certainly wouldn't fit. So North Western was forced to order specially built buses with lower build bodywork. The first of these would be the Bedford VALs. Now, for anybody who's lived on the moon over the last few decades, the Bedford VAL was very well known in media. Not only was it used as a getaway vehicle in the Italian Job film with Michael Caine, one also took the Beatles on a magical mystery tour. However, these weren't as glamorous as either of those coaches because these were fitted with Strachan's bus-seated bodywork, these arriving in 1964.
But being a Bedford chassis, they were built to a lightweight construction, so weren't destined for an incredibly long life.
These, of course, would be replaced by Bristol RELLs, with flattened Eastern Coachworks bodywork, these being delivered in January 1972. If you would like me to do a video on these rather unique buses, please comment down below and let me know. Now, by the time these buses were delivered, the writing was very much on the wall for North Western. Like many other bus companies all over the country, on the 1st of January 1969, North Western passed to the ownership of the National Bus Company. Now, the Transport Act of 1968 would also see the setting up of the Passenger Transport Authorities, and these were bodies that would oversee all sorts of transport in a certain urban area, whether it be road or rail. Unfortunately for North Western, 60% of its stage mileage was in the area of the new South East Lancashire and North East Cheshire Passenger Transport Executive, otherwise known as SELNEC. The PTE would go on the 1st of November 1969 to absorb 11 local authority undertakings and was given the responsibility of coordinating all the stage carriage services within its boundaries and area. SELNEC PTE immediately started negotiations with the National Bus Company to see if it could take on these company services that operated within this area. By 1971, the deal was done, and it was agreed that the PTE would take over the routes of North Western that operated within its area. This would see the setting up of a company called North Western SELNEC Division Road Car Company Limited, and this was formed in November 1971. And on the 1st of January 1972, SELNEC took over the operation of all the services of North Western Road Car Company in its operating area.
At the time the company was split, there was 25 Bristol VRs on order from Bristol and Eastern Coachworks, and this order would be taken over by SELNEC, the PTE. Now, despite SELNEC requesting all their features to be incorporated into the build, they still stood out like 25 sore thumbs in the PTE fleet when they arrived in April 1973. These all carried the SELNEC Cheshire fleet names and were, I believe, all based at Stockport. And when SELNEC was renamed Greater Manchester Transport PTE, they passed into that fleet, where they no doubt proved equally popular in a fleet that was populated by Daimler Fleet Lines and Leyland Atlanteans. Now, I know I've said this already on this video, and to be fair, if I had £1 for every time I said this, I could probably retire early. But if you'd like me to make a video on this batch of rather unique and interesting Bristol VRs, please comment down below. Because it's not a straightforward story, and there's all sorts of tales of espionage and such, and, well, I won't go too much into it, but it didn't have a particularly happy ending. Spoiler alert. So back to our main feature, with 60% of North Western's routes passing into SELNEC PTE's ownership.
Now, this didn't really leave an awful lot of North Western left, and the bits that were left were probably not very financially viable without the urban areas supporting them. The decision was taken by the National Bus Company that the remaining section of North Western would be divided up between other members of the National Bus Company. In January 1972, this would see services in Biddulph, Macclesfield and Northwich transfer to Crosville Motor Services, whilst on the 4th of March 1972, services in Buxton, Matlock and Castleton passed to Trent Motor Traction Company. This same day would see the newly inaugurated company, North Western SELNEC Division Road Car Company, pass into SELNEC PTE ownership, and this would be renamed SELNEC Cheshire Bus Company Limited. Now, all this left North Western as just literally a coach operator without any bus routes or buses at all. However, the National Bus Company had plans, and all this was to soon change. And National Travel North West was in fact the North Western Road Car Company Limited that had been renamed. This took place on the 6th of February 1974, and that was the end of North Western. Or was it? In the run-up to the deregulation of the bus industry in the mid-1980s, many of the larger subsidiaries of the National Bus Company were to be split up. Now this would do two things. It would boost competition and it would make them more attractive to buyers. One of these companies that would be split up would be Ribble Motor Services, whose operations stretched across the whole of the northwest England and took in the counties of Cumbria, Lancashire, Greater Manchester and Merseyside. Now the Cumbrian operations of Ribble was hived off in March 1986, and this would become Cumberland Motor Services. Around the same time, it was agreed that the depots of Aintree, Bootle, Skelmersdale and Wigan, located in Merseyside and Lancashire and Greater Manchester, were to transfer to a new North Western Road Car Company. And this company was officially launched on the 7th of September at an event at Aintree Racecourse. This new company inherited 260 buses from Ribble and adopted a bold new livery featuring a diagonal red and blue flick broken up by a grey stripe, which replaced the National Bus Company corporate red that Ribble had used. Initially the company was based in Bootle, but operations later moved to Aintree in 1989. In March 1988, the Draw Lane Group purchased North Western from the National Bus Company. In February 1989, Draw Lane purchased the English operations of the former National Bus Company subsidiary Crosville. Now Crosville had been split from its Welsh operations and was running services in Cheshire and the Wirral, as well as parts of Greater Manchester. Now Draw Lane also owned Midland Red North, and these former Crosville operations bordered not only the North Western's operating area, but that of the Midland Red North. And this would result in a bit of a shake-up, with the depots of Runcorn, Warrington, Winsford and 80 vehicles being transferred to the ownership of North Western. And this is where it starts to get really complicated, so just stick with me. In October 1989, Draw Lane did a deal with Stagecoach to sell North Western's operations in Blackburn to Stagecoach Ribble, and this would be in exchange for Draw Lane purchasing both Greater Manchester-based minibus operator Beeline Bus Company and Stagecoach East Midlands frontrunner North West operation.
The Beeline branding, which up until that point had been used exclusively on minibuses,
was now being used for all of Draw Lane services in South and Central Manchester, and they were using conventional double-decker buses. In 1994, there was a rebranding of the company's livery, and it would see the diagonal livery replaced by a rather more conventional style red, yellow and blue livery.
Around this time, the company would undertake a number of agreements with its larger neighbours.
The first of these would see it working with Merseybus in Merseyside to coordinate and share the services in the city. The second agreement being with GM Buses North to give up its Wigan town services in exchange for connecting services between Wigan, Leigh and St Helens and Warrington. However, all this was quashed by the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, which found North Western, Merseybus and GM Buses and other Merseyside bus operators guilty of working together in breach of fair trade. Are the Monopolies and Mergers Commission still actually going? They'd have their work cut out in this day and age, wouldn't they? Meanwhile, Draw Lane had acquired National Express Group in 1991, and in the spring of 1993, the bus operations of National Express were split into British Bus to allow National Express to float on the London Stock Exchange. Thus, North Western was now under the British Bus banner.
In August 1996, British Bus
was acquired by the Cowie Group, who rebranded themselves as Arriva in November 1997. And the North Western Road Car Company, or the new North Western Road Car Company, was renamed to Arriva North West in January 1998. And sadly, that really is the end. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the A to Z of National Bus Company histories, and I hope it wasn't all too confusing in the end. Personally, my head is spinning and I can't wait to lay down in a dark room. If you did enjoy this video, please show your appreciation by liking it and sharing it, as doing this helps the channel grow and it encourages me to make more videos like this and the other ones here on my channel on YouTube. And talking of which, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you receive the notifications when I make future releases in this and my other series here on my channel. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all the new subscribers and the new viewers to the channel. It's lovely to have you on board, and we will cover a range of things. But if you do have any suggestions, please put them down in the comments down below. Also, don't forget to share your memories and thoughts about the whole North Western Road Car Company scenario. I do enjoy reading all your comments, so it's always great to hear from you. Once again, thank you so very much for watching and supporting the channel. Bye for now.